does this mean?
Hello. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre's Talking Point series. And can I say, I just think it's fantastic. So many of you have paid your money and taken your time on this Friday night to come out and hear this, as we've been described already, this eminent panel on this question. I'm Fran Kelly from ABC Radio National Breakfast, and the question tonight is Australian democracy broke? I think now's as good a time to consider it, given the complete landslide in New South Wales over a couple of weeks ago just about wiped out our oldest political party in a state which, since the World War II, has been essentially a Labor stronghold. And the voters, of course, handed the other side of politics what looks to be an unassailable time in power, I think, for at least 8 years. Then there's the federal situation. You might describe it as clunky. You might describe it as unworkable. Power-sharing arrangements in the federal parliament where the minority Labor government spends a lot of time talking and dealing with the crossbenchers to get their votes locked in, and then you wonder where is the time for good, sound policy. On top of that, there's voter disenchantment, evident wherever you look. In the blogosphere, in the Twitterverse, it's in talkback radio, it's in the letters pages of our daily newspapers. It's even in the voter returns, if you look at the last federal election, one of the highest informal votes on record. Many would suggest that was no accident. People are over it. Cynical, unimpressed, distrusting, disengaged. It's hard to see it any other way. Hardly the stuff of a vibrant, functioning democracy. Is the distaste justified? And if so, whose fault is it? Even more importantly for tonight's discussion, I think, how do you fix a broken democracy? Where do you start? Well, let's start tonight by introducing our panel. Before we do that, a reminder, turn off your mobile phones, switch it on silent, whatever you can do. And also think about a question you might like to ask towards the end of this discussion. We've only got an hour tonight. The last 15 minutes will be for questions from you. There'll be a microphone at the front, downstairs and upstairs, and when the time comes, I'll get you to line up behind the mic and it's over to you. First now, to the panel. Malcolm Fraser is a former Prime Minister and Liberal Party Life member, though no longer pays his dues, I understand, considered variously by the party these days as either a thorn in the side, a hero, or perhaps the conscience of the Liberal Party. Lindsay is the only bloke on stage not called Malcolm tonight. He's a former Cabinet Minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments. He was a member of Kevin Rudd's infamous Kitchen Cabinet, Gang of Four, or Strategic Priorities Budget Committee, whatever you like to call it. He's regarded, I think, as one of Labor's best thinkers of recent times, and his latest book comes out in 3 weeks. It's titled Sideshow: Dumbing Down Democracy. Malcolm Turnbull is a former Liberal opposition leader, current Shadow Communications Minister. He's also a pioneer amongst our politicians in the social networking space with his own phone app. If you've got a smartphone, log on to Malcolm's phone, sign on to Malcolm's phone app. It's a laugh a minute. And Margaret Simons... No, it's not at all. Is a freelance journalist and author, currently the media commentator for Crikey. She's written 10 books for her sins, the latest, The Political Memoirs of Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser, let's start with you tonight. This is not a new question, really. If there was an easy fix for the problems we've got, we'd have done it before we got to the low point of the last federal election campaign. Before that election, in the months leading up to that election, you were publicly scathing of the leadership of both parties. Is that leadership cause for a broken democracy or a reflection of it, do you think?
Well, it's a reflection of it. The democracy, if you look at our constitution, I think it served us pretty well for quite a long while. And one of the problems is people think that, things are going badly, well, let's have a constitutional change and it'll all be right. But the truth is, good people can make a pretty lousy constitution work very well, but bad people will wreck even the most perfect constitution. I think people are the problem. Party apparatchiks. Look, there are some problems with the constitution, but they're minor concerned with the problems of people. And there aren't enough people in the parliament who've done something before they got to the parliament. Kids say when they're at university. Now, it's easy to say that because, as far as I know it, the people here have done something before they got to the parliament. So I'm not being rude to them. But it's people the problem. People
are the problem. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about that. Lindsay, you actually are an apparatchik, really. I mean, You hadn't done a lot more before you went into the unions and a politician's office, and you are one of those people, but let's say that perhaps you're an exception to the rule. You've written about the ailing political debate in your new book, and you say the political process is at the heart of our democratic system. If it's being degraded, the implications for all of us are very serious. How is it being degraded? Can you give us an example of a degradation that you've witnessed during your almost 2 decades, I think, in the Parliament?
Theatre's always been central to the political process going back to ancient Greece, but in my view, what's been happening, particularly in the last 10 years or so, is that the theatre, the performance of politics has completely taken over. The way politics is portrayed in our media is less and less about the content of the issues and more just about entertainment. So I spent the last 5 to 7 years of my life in the political process telling people privately that I was in the entertainment business and that occasionally I got to do something vaguely serious on a good day if I was lucky. And that is a serious problem. And if you want to know why spin exists, why you have robotic politicians reciting scripts and avoiding questions, well, the answer is because of the way the media treats politics and the way politicians get drastically punished for stepping outside that framework. Now, before we blame the media too much, then ask, well, why do they behave like that? And the answer is commercial pressures. So to some degree, the ABC and SBS are a bit exempt from this, but they are, I think, showing the signs of these influences. But basically now politics is portrayed in this country overwhelmingly as a contest of personalities, as idiosyncratic and unusual and odd people, gotcha journalism, all these things that are ultimately got nothing to do with the content of issues. And if you want one example, look at the saturation coverage in the wake of the Queensland floods about who cried and who didn't cry. Now, my guess is that people who are victims of the floods are a bit more interested in what their governments are going to do about it rather than who was crying. But the issue of whether or not a particular leader was wooden or whether this leader was a good leader because she cried or didn't cry, that was what attracted all the attention. So what's essentially happening is that Australian media coverage of politics is turning into the Oprah Winfrey show. That is a big problem for our democracy. OK, I've got a feeling the media is going to get a fair drubbing here tonight, but Malcolm Turnbull, you can give your say too. You were a player in the 2010 election. You were there from the inside. Did you feel like you were just, performing a role in a bit of theatre? Was it all vaudeville?
Well, look, I wasn't that close to the inside because I wasn't in the. I certainly wasn't in the shadow cabinet.
No, but
and
you were a candidate.
I was running in my own seat. I'm pleased that I gave a speech at the beginning of the election campaign about immigration policy and how immigration policy should be a function, or our approach to immigration should be dictated by the economic needs of Australia and not any other rhetorical devices. So that was one useful contribution, I thought, to make. I think that I agree with what you said to us earlier. We shouldn't all agree, so we'll find something to argue about furiously.
And perhaps the audience.
Firstly, Lindsay. What sort of name is that? Malcolm. Let's pick on Lindsay. But it's
as Scottish as Malcolm. What are you talking about?
But look, Lindsay and Malcolm put their finger on it. And Lindsay, what he said about the politics being reported as a game is right. Let me give you this example. There are numerous big policy issues, around. Whether it is climate policy, whether it's water policy, whether it's how we're going to manage something I gave a speech about yesterday about how we're going to manage the proceeds of this boom. Are we going to blow it like we've often done in the past? These are all big economic issues. But when you look at the debate, it is all too often that politicians are simply engaging in a series of sound bites designed to get a grab on the 6 o'clock news, and the press gallery finds it easier to write about politics as a game, so you get news replaced by commentary. Now, Lachlan Harris, who used to be Kevin Rudd's press secretary, has made the point recently, and I think he's dead right, that we've gone from having we shouldn't talk about a 24-hour news cycle, it's really a 24-hour commentary cycle. And if you just think about the newspapers that cover politics, how much of it is actually a discussion of policy, and how much of it is, you know, is Kevin stalking Julia? You know, where does
is Malcolm stalking Tony?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
whatever. And it's all about the game. You know, how many think about how many of the political writers and commentators, how many have actually made a thoughtful, consistent, considered contribution to, for example, what is the most cost-effective way of cutting Australia's greenhouse gas emissions? You know, where is that? And you search in vain to find a detailed analysis of that and so many other issues. So I think the politicians and the media are in a sort of a death lock, in the sense that they need each other but loathe each other, but they're each contributing to this dumbing down of the policy debate, and I think that is a big part of the problem.
Okay, Margaret, is the dumbing down of the policy debate, do you agree with these three gentlemen here, is that a central problem to the dysfunction that we're seeing in our politic at the moment? Is that enough to say democracy is broken? And, I mean, I just have to, I do have to defend my media colleagues to some degree, I think, and try not to do it all night, but I certainly think there are serious issues written on issues like climate change. I mean, Lenore Taylor makes a serious contribution regularly, Laura Tingle makes a serious contribution regularly on these issues.
Okay, keep nominating.
Can you name a good man?
Yeah.
Well, hang on, that's quite a broad question. But Margaret, I mean, the death roll that Malcolm was talking about, the death grip between the politicians and the media, is that the central issue? And is that, how do we address that?
Well, I don't think to say that journalists are at fault, which they certainly are, is to let these gentlemen off the hook. We can all think of examples of frankness and honesty in politicians recently, and usually they've played very well with both the media and the general public. We also have means these days by which politicians, and I'm sure the Shadow Communications Minister understands this, can reach right past the media and talk direct to the public in ways that weren't previously possible. But journalists are at fault, certainly. It would be great if we could have consistent coverage of politics as though it was something in which we all have a stake as citizens, as though it actually matters, rather than just as a game. And too often it's all about, who's first past the post. I love the comment that Jay Rosen, who's one of the leading thinkers in the world on media futures, made when he was out here last year. He said, "You have a program called Insiders, and the insiders are journalists? That's extraordinary." Now, there was a time when journalists were the outsiders, when they were the larrikins, when they were the unpopular ones, when a good journalist was regarded with respect and a little fear. These days, journalists, I think, have got too much of a stake in the system as it plays at the moment, and they don't reach out to the citizens and say, what's your agenda? What would you like these gentlemen to talk about?
Malcolm,
That's very profound, I think. Yeah.
Malcolm Fraser, when you were in politics, it was a different media landscape. We had nowhere near the 24-hour media cycle. We weren't tweeting, we weren't blogging, none of that was happening. How different was the relationship between journalists and politicians? Were they more outsiders, as Margaret suggested?
It depends on the journalist, it would depend on the politician. But I don't think it's reasonable to blame journalists for everything. I mean, the poor print media, you guys on the airwaves get all the news first, so the print media have to make up something. So you've therefore got people, you've got people who give opinions, and you buy the Australian, you buy the Age, you're buying a lot of opinions. You might respect people giving the opinions, you might not. But do you really want those opinions? They're not newspapers, they should be called opinion papers.
Yes, but okay, but and I'll throw this open to anyone who wants it. This notion that it's 24-hour commentary, too much opinion. The new mediums are loaded with opinion. It's everybody putting their opinion out. Blogosphere is full of everybody's opinion.
Can I make
that seems to be what people want.
Yeah. Well, it might be what people want, but if politicians are not going to talk about serious issues, if they're not going to have a serious debate, whether it's climate change, if they're going to be seen to be playing politics for votes on every damned issue, We went for about 40 years with a bipartisan policy in relation to refugees and immigration. Now we play politics with everything.
I think there's nothing wrong with opinion. The more opinion, the better. The real question is opinion about what? If it's opinion about who's up, who's down, who's stalking who is going to launch a leadership challenge against who's rigging the numbers in what pre-selection ballot, then that's the problem. Because it's not enough opinion and genuine discourse in accessible mass media. Yeah, lots of people have never heard of Twitter, believe it or not. In accessible mass media, there is less and less discourse about the content of issues, about health reform, about water issues, about climate change, and more it is simply about the sporting contest between the array of individuals on both sides, and indeed in the Greens and Independents, and all of the little idiosyncrasies of those contexts. And that's the problem.
But in a large part, the media are followers. It was the media who followed politicians when they were arguing whether the government should or shouldn't pay for airfares for people going from Christmas Island to funerals. And there are far more important things to argue about than that.
That's fair, isn't it? I mean, Lindsay Tanner and Malcolm Turnbull, that is fair, that it's all very well to say that's what the media reports. Where are the politicians talking in depth about policy and daring to put forward contentious ideas that they know will be contentious, that will be provocative, that are visionary? I mean, it was Paul Keating who said, you know, let's flick the switch to vaudeville at certain times. Politicians are very aware of the impact of point scoring versus policy.
The answer is politicians do what gets them publicity.
Well, that's
if they have to put on a silly hat,
Lindsay.
If they have to put on a silly hat to get publicity, they put on the silly hat. What awaits a politician of serious substance who puts out the kind of propositions you put is either huge internal controversy within their party or more likely glorious irrelevance, because they are either going to be set up as being breaking party ranks without serious consideration of substance. For example, how much debate has there been in the last few days about the taxation of family trusts? There's been virtually zero discussion about the content of that issue, but lots of discussion about whether Joe Hockey has been humiliated, has had to backflip back down, etc., etc. So that's what awaits politicians who do things other than what the media frame dictates.
Yes, but partly that comes out in that way because Joe Hockey just put that out into the atmosphere. There was no argument about it. We'll just tax family trusts.
But that's what Fran's advocating, that politicians should do that. No, the answer is
I thought she was advocating
Anyway, Malcolm was going to follow me.
A serious discussion or statement on the issue which had some substance. Joe's statement had no substance. It was
Margaret,
a statement in the air.
What do you make of this discussion? And is it getting us anywhere closer to the notion of if our democracy is broken, how we might fix it? I mean, is this the crux of the problem, this relationship between politicians and the media, or is it something else? Is it the way our two major parties in this system are functioning, the way it goes back to the people we're recruiting, the apparatchiks who's in power, how things are controlled?
Well, I think all of the above. I mean, I think it's certainly possible, I'm increasingly thinking likely, that the party political system is broken, but that's not quite the same as saying that democracy is broken. But it seems to me that there is a great hunger there for people to hear ideas debated, and our profession is certainly at fault. But whenever you see a program like Q&A, whenever you tune into the more serious debates that you do see on the internet, and while most people haven't heard of Twitter, just about everybody's heard of Facebook, I think, when you do tune into that, you'll find people are hungry to engage seriously with ideas. Our profession of journalism is largely failing to satisfy that hunger, with some exceptions, but politicians are to blame as well. Joe Hockey may well have an argument, may well have a case, may well have issues to put out there for discussion. I'm not sure that they would be seriously reported by the mainstream media, but there are other methods as well. And in terms of the media, and perhaps particularly the national broadcaster, what about actually holding community forums before an election to say, what do you think the issues are? What would you like explained? What would you like the questions to be that we put to politicians, and pursue that agenda as journalists, whether or not these guys want to talk about it?
Let me make a couple of... again, I'm being unduly agreeable, but I think a great deal of good sense has
should try it more often.
Spoken. Well, I've often been criticised for being too agreeable.
So have I.
Can I?
Nobody's ever said it about me.
Can I make an observation about the way Parliament works? Question time has undoubtedly improved since the election because there are limits on the answers can't be more than 4 minutes. I mean, Kevin Rudd, I don't know how it felt like on your side of the House, but there were moments, when, one would look at a sort of a sharpened pencil with a thought, if I jab that into my eyeball, will that be less painful than listening to the Prime Minister go on for 8 minutes? It was really desperate. But here's the thing. Question time has just become a theatrical, combat. In the British Parliament, and I'm not, by any means an expert on its procedures, they have question time days for particular ministries.
It is so dull.
And it may be dull.
The entertainment business again.
This is the thing,
see what
Fran.
I mean?
You see, Fran.
I know, but I've sat through it and you haven't.
But
I can tell you as a politician, I've sat through a lot of dull things in my time.
Yeah. Well, I used to be a lawyer, so I know dullness. But I just think that there are so many important issues of policy that rarely get ventilated in question time because the focus is just on the Prime Minister and one particular issue of the day. And it is a great forum. A lot of people listen to it. And the feedback I always get, in my electorate office, obviously I'm, an MHR, so, represent a lot of people, as we all do. People are irritated by the combativeness of question time, the pointless combativeness, because they're listening to it because they want to learn something and hear about what the Prime Minister or the Minister for whatever has got to say about something, and they're not getting that information. And can I just make an observation too about what Margaret said about ideas? I think you're dead right. I think the success of Q&A is an eloquent testimony to the fact that there is interest in longer format programs that will enable policy issues to be debated. The social media and the internet is revolutionising the media and, of course, really undercutting the conventional media. I'll just give you a little example from something I did the other day. I gave a speech at Sydney University about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, in which I was very critical of the Prime Minister for saying that he was essentially a criminal when, however undesirable his conduct may have been from her point of view, he clearly hadn't broken any Australian law, he hadn't broken any American law, the publication of the cables couldn't possibly be restrained in Australia, and leading figures in America were calling for him to be assassinated, which I would have thought should have evoked a rather stiff response from an Australian Prime Minister. Anyway, that was the speech I gave at the law school. I put it up on my website and I tweeted it. Now, there's about 45,000 people follow me on Twitter, which means there's about 45,000 devices who get that notice. But then people retweet it. And, I just had a look at that, and there were accounts on Twitter that retweeted it, some of which had hundreds of thousands of followers. So you can see that something can go viral, can go internationally and viral without any involvement from the mainstream media and at no cost to the publisher. I mean, cost for me doing that blog and doing the tweet isn't virtually nothing.
So the message of that is politicians do have a venue. If you feel like the mainstream media is not allowing you to get a real message out, there is a venue there. I'm not sure there's a lot of messages being put out. I mean, Malcolm, you're a case in point. We know your position, for instance, on climate change and some of the responses to it, and you can't talk about it at length because of the constraints of your party's position.
I can and I do, and I'm very much on the record.
Not whenever I ask you on the radio,
Fran, nobody has been more consistently successful in getting me to be indiscreet on the air than you.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
I think there's no doubt, and probably everyone here, it's obvious in many ways that the 24-hour news cycle and the social networking is changing the position of the mainstream media, and it will ultimately perhaps change that relationship. But what about, let's get away from the media for a moment, because I'm sure we'll probably go back to it later with audience questions, but what about ideas for changing the way our democracy is functions and structured. I think Malcolm Fraser, you have an idea. You've got a starting point for trying to recruit our politicians, the people you talked about earlier, in a different way. Tell us about your idea.
Well, I would, and I suppose my thoughts on this have been crystallised by the pre-selection for Higgins, because in Higgins we had, well, some people would say 2 candidates, but I think the party believed probably that there was only one electable candidate. And several other people had wanted to stand, they'd been talked out of standing.
So this is after Peter Costello's resigned?
In the old days, people would have said, look, Higgins, blue ribbon seat, we've got to have as many people as possible, 12, 20, the more the better. Now you mightn't get it because there's a favoured candidate, but who knows? Pre-selections are unpredictable, and if you're an attractive character and if you make a decent speech, maybe you'll come out the winner. So throw your hat in the ring, it'll be a good thing. If you don't get it, it'll stand you instead for the future. But instead, how do you get just one person? Well, the party organisation, the party apparatchik, if you like, gets the pre-selection. Now, to try and break the power of factions within the party... And
we are talking about the Liberal Party here.
This is Liberal Party, yes, Liberal Party. But I would like us to make it, by law, every member of a party in every seat would have a vote for the candidate for that seat. In other words, you would find the best way of running an American-style primary for elections in Australia. So for this, every Liberal in Higgins could register as a Liberal with the Commonwealth Electoral Office, and everyone would vote for the candidate. And that would break, I believe, the power of the factions immediately. But I'd put one rider on that. On a number of seats, the number of members are so small, and I think this might apply to the Labor Party as well as the Liberal Party, that you would have to go well beyond the boundary of one electorate to get a respectable number of voters. But if you had to go statewide, have people vote for a candidate for a seat as a primary, then I think you break the power of the party organisation. Because speaking of this state in particular, independents or people of independent mind used to be tolerated. But then people of independent mind were hounded out of the party in this state. You've got to stick to the line. You can't have an independent thought or an independent view. We just want people who are just going to do the one thing. And that's how you get the allegiance going from school to university. Who can I work for? What member of parliament? Can I work for the organisation? And people have never done anything else. And we want people who've done other things, who've been successful and know what life's like for lots and lots of other Australians. Now, so I'd go for primaries, widen the voting capacity in the selection of candidates.
And that's an idea. Lindsay Tanner, I mean, it's extraordinary to hear Malcolm Fraser talk like that, because it's exactly the same conversation people are having about the Labor Party. I mean, he could have been talking about the Labor Party.
Oh, I was, but I didn't say so.
And funnily enough, but Lindsay Tanner, John Faulkner, Bob Carr and Steve Bracks came to a similar conclusion in their review of the Labor after the last election, to trial primaries for pre-selections, an idea which I have a suspicion hasn't got very far at the National Executive today. But
look, I don't know what's happened today, but I think it's certainly an idea worth progressing. But we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that rules determine how people behave. They certainly influence how people behave, but underneath it all, culture is everything, and values, and how people within political parties see their role and their responsibility. And I think there has been a deterioration of that pretty well across the board over an extended period of time. So if you've got a problem of attitudes, a problem of culture, then changes of rules, and I've campaigned going back since 1990 to reform Labor Party rules and structures very much along these lines, with only modest success. And some of the things I've proposed still need to be done and have been reflected in the Faulkner-Carr-Bracks report. But these are necessary but not sufficient by themselves to induce change. I just want to add...
so I think you need to say that, how do you change the culture within a party?
Well, I think that's ultimately a question of will, but it's also a question of electoral behaviour. So that if you look at the Labor Party in New South Wales, it now has a huge amount of soul-searching to do, because it has been punished big time for a whole range of things, including the manifestations of a particular culture. And so it now, I believe, will really have to go back to the drawing board and think through not just formal policies and rules and these things, but also who are we, what do we represent, what do we stand for, how do we conduct ourselves. So the ultimate punishment for misbehaviour by political parties and politicians is always at the ballot box. Sometimes it's delivered, sometimes it's not. So that's the constraint under which everybody operates.
Margaret, are we barking up the wrong tree here, focusing on, you know, the major parties and the culture within them and the pre-selection processes within them, factions? Is there a bigger question about the future of the major parties themselves? Are major parties in this day and age reaching their use-by date, and are they essential to a functioning democracy?
I think quite possibly. I mean, I'm not sure about that, but I do think that it pays to have a bit of a historical perspective. And I know you said you didn't want to concentrate on the media, but we are living through a communications revolution that brings all sorts of threats. And one of the reasons there's so much opinion in the media is because it's cheap and the business model is broken for mainstream media. But it's not the first time that's happened. How did we get the democracy that we have today? It was as a result, largely, of the invention of the printing press, which made modern democratic forms possible. We're now living through a revolution which is at least the equivalent of that, probably greater. And we have to expect that it will change democratic forms, and in a sense, you're all behind the eight ball on that. You're arguing about something which is already flooding over you. And in a sense, the change, I think, in the way democracy works is already out of your control.
It's hard to get a handle on it, isn't it? I noticed Mark Latham said in the new foreword to his 2005 diaries, and that's not necessarily a recommendation that you read it, he says, due to extreme levels of public apathy and media derision, party politics in Australia has hollowed out. Few people care enough about organised politics to sacrifice their time and become dedicated activists. Whether we like it or not, mass parties have gone the way of the dinosaur. Now, Malcolm Turnbull, I wonder if you agree with Mark Latham there, or how does that notion of public apathy match, and Margaret, you might have a view on this too, with the democratisation we are seeing happening through the social media, the new medias? People are getting engaged in ways that they never had before.
They're not apathetic at all, I would say.
Can I... Robert Putnam, the American academic, you know, who wrote the very famous book Bowling Alone, identified the decline in social capital and that pointed out that really the generation that fought the Second World War was the last generation that had been great joiners, great voters in America, where of course it's not compulsory, great members of all sorts of social organisations, clubs, political parties, etc. And subsequent generations, for a whole range of reasons, and do not join so much. Perhaps they're busier, you know, couples, both, you know, husbands and wives are working. It's a different it's a different world. And so political party memberships have been diminishing, and they are in, particularly in the Labor Party, I'd say, less so in the Liberal Party. They are much less representative of the community than they were a generation or two ago. Now, that's something that is how do you deal with that? You know, people are not going to go out and sit in a drafty church hall and go to a branch meeting in the way they would perhaps, you know, when I first joined the Liberal Party many years ago. So it's a different world. Yes, social media can engage people in a different way, but I think there is a powerful argument for primaries. Now, I understand, Malcolm, what you're saying about primaries is not what we'd call in the Liberal Party a plebiscite where all of the members of a political party get to vote, as they did in Higgins, is my understanding, because you have plebiscites in Victoria. And I have to say, you know, Kelly O'Dwyer might have been the absolute favourite, but she's a very good member, so I hope we're not going to... That might be something we can disagree on. I think she's doing a very good job. But primaries is where literally you say whoever wants to, you know, have a say in who the Liberal National Labor candidate will be in this electorate can cast a vote. Now,
as they did in Tamworth before the last election.
That's right. The national parties...
And in the state seat of Kilsyth for the Labor Party before the Victorian election.
Yeah, so there have been... The Nationals experimented with this in New South Wales and were very, very pleased with the results. So I think that is a big that is a big opportunity, because it does enable you to break out of, that straitjacket of a party membership base that is very diminished and less representative of the whole community, for all of the reasons Putnam describes, than it was a couple of generations ago.
Which suggests that there's not so much apathy, which is what we've been sort of supposing for all this time, but if you invite, if you open up, they will come.
Yeah, I think the structures are no longer, the structure of membership of political parties is no longer consonant with the lifestyle and work-life balance, etc., of people in 2011, as opposed to 1971 or 1961 or 1951. And I think that's the reason why you don't have anything like the same number of people joining political parties.
Now, there's lots of issues that stem from this, and we haven't even talked about sort of funding for parties and funding for democracy. But we've got 7 minutes here on stage before we throw open to the floor for 15 minutes, and it would be good if we didn't just talk tonight, but we came up with a few key ideas of changes that we think could make a difference. Now, perhaps primaries is one, and I think Peter Reith has hinted too in his review of the Liberal Party that he's keen on that idea too. So we've got Labor and Liberal both coming up with this notion.
I'll give you one small one that follows on from something that Malcolm referred to before. Question time, he was being polite. Question time is a total joke. It is basically a daily micro...
It's not a funny joke.
Yeah, and not a funny one. It is basically a daily micro-audition for the 6 o'clock news. That's essentially the jockeying of both individuals and parties to get that little golden piece of 30 seconds on the 6 o'clock news. What I'd like to see, and no government is ever likely to do this, is to require ministers to answer questions in front of their relevant parliamentary committees in the House of Representatives. Then you could have, even if it's only 2 or 3 times a year, you could have the Minister for Transport go to the House Transport Committee in public with Hansard, Labor, Liberal, whoever else members, actually ask questions about transport policy. I know it's a radical thought. We don't often get serious questions on mainstream policy issues. Lots of gotcha nonsense in the House of Reps, and of course almost all questions from the opposition are directed to the Prime Minister and occasionally the Treasurer. So a lot of ministers for very serious things will go from 1 month to the next without getting asked a serious question. So
why is that different to the Senate committee system where the ministers need to go? Because that's only ministers in the Senate, or?
Well, and it's not a question time situation.
I see.
And believe it or not, most power still resides in the House of Representatives. So if you actually had individual ministers, I think, knowing that every few months they would front up, and there's been a small reform in this direction in the main committee where, as part of the appropriations debate, I think it is from memory, individual ministers have a half-an-hour session where members can ask them questions. But I think it would be better if you actually empowered the House committees to have an occasional question time with the relevant minister. That would force, I think, at least to some degree, a public dialogue, a public questioning about the content of issues that are never likely to get much airtime in question time.
I think those changes would be a help, but I think also the discussion so far is partly missing the point and partly blaming the media more than the media ought to be blamed.
Thank
it's
you,
not often. Well, I said it because you're here, Fran. And because if things are not seriously discussed between politicians, they're really not discussed at all. And I think there are many people who believe that serious issues are just bypassed by politicians. Now, if anyone says anything about Afghanistan, we're going to stay there till the job's done. Well, what is the job and what are they going to do? I've, in recent times, had a couple of talks with a war widow whose husband was killed in Afghanistan. And according to her, and it's a narrow sample if you like, Australian soldiers in Afghanistan wonder why there isn't more debate about the role, about what they're meant to be doing, about how long they're going to be there. Why are our leaders just saying they're staying till the job's done, not too damn sure what the job is or how long is it going to take? There's not much debate about whether we should be there or should not be there. There's no debate between politicians about our role. No, we just do what America wants. Now, people will put a gloss on that and say we make our own decisions, but really, look, America is enormously important. I support the ANZUS Treaty, but we should not be involved in a war with the United States unless we have somebody in the councils in Washington where the strategic decisions are made about that war, rather than being informed about it 24 hours before America announces a decision. There are...
Okay, Malcolm, I'm just going to...
Fran, so if politicians won't debate these things, the media is not going to debate these things.
So this is an argument for more debate within our
Well, it's an argument for serious debate on serious issues, and it would also involve cheap politicking being left out of the debate.
Okay.
Can I just say, Malcolm, at the risk of creating some disharmony, there was a debate about Afghanistan when when the Parliament came back after the election, and there were a lot of speeches given, and a lot of them were, along the lines you describe. But there were a lot of very thoughtful contributions, and while I think the overwhelming sentiment, of the House anyway, was that we should, we shouldn't change our strategy. Nonetheless, these issues of, what is counterinsurgency doctrine? Is it working? Are we actually making the situation worse by what we're doing? These issues were very, coherently and I think, eloquently in some cases canvassed in that debate. So that didn't get a lot of reporting, I'd have to say. Can I just make one other little there's a paradox, one of the many paradoxes in politics.
It got debated because the Greens asked for it, didn't it?
You pardon?
Yes, it
got
did.
debated because the Greens asked for it.
Yeah,
okay,
that's true.
I'm going to pull everyone back on track.
I just want to point out this one thing. One of the problems with question time, and everything Lindsay said about the 6 o'clock news is dead right. Everyone knows that. Every member of the House knows that. One of the problems is that the questioning is not at all forensic. You see, you ran through it, Malcolm. And it would be better to say, if you say to the Defence Minister, what are we doing in Afghanistan? Well, Mr. Speaker, we're there to ensure the job is done. Thank you. Can you just describe what the job is? So you get the absurdity that politicians are much less accountable in the Parliament than they are on your radio program or on the 7:30 report or on Q&A. And so we've effectively created a question time which is incapable of securing any meaningful answers. So it is just a theatre.
Which goes back to Lindsay's point. Margaret, I'm wondering if you have an idea, a solution, something you'd like to throw into this that you think might make a difference?
Well, I think our profession of journalism has to be prepared to innovate, not only in things like delivery platforms and all that sort of thing, but actually reconceive what the job is. And the job is not necessarily to be insiders. The job is very much to find things out and to tell people about them, but also to broker the citizens, who I don't think are disengaged at all. They might be disengaged from question time. Who cares about question time? The 6 o'clock news is not what it used to be. They are engaged in the ideas, and I think it's our job to enable a new form, and hopefully a healthier form, of democracy.
And just from my own perspective, in the last election, on my program, Radio National Breakfast, we made a conscious effort to try and talk about policy, that it not just be the game. And it was damned hard to find the policy differences between the two parties on a whole lot of areas.
It's the emperor's cloak.
Unless you're talking about sort of, that one's going to give teachers a bit more, or that one's got super clinics and are they good, I mean, really, this is small beer.
Policy got closer together the longer the election went.
That's right, Malcolm.
Well, I think I would also like to apply electrodes to any journalist who ever suggests that there's something embarrassing about having an idea in a politician. And we see that very often, people saying, he's a policy wonk, or, he bores for Australia and that sort of thing, just because somebody actually has an idea that they want to talk about. It's almost as though, anybody who says something frank or thoughtful has made some sort of a gaffe. I think journalists who do that should have electrodes applied to them, which are more activated every time it happens.
Okay, so we're going to throw over to you now.
I didn't realise you were a Baathist.
And I'm going to,
Even I'm not that hard line.
yeah, because you're all thinking where those electrodes are going to be applied.
The men have all got their legs crossed, I might say.
It depends who gets to apply them, I think, is the key question.
As we wrap up this part of it, if I could ask people who have a question to go and stand at the microphones, one up above, one here in the middle. Please, I urge you, as Tony Jones would say, questions, not comments. And we only have 15 minutes. Just introduce yourself, direct your question if you'd like to. And just before I throw to you, I think it's fair to say we do have 4 ideas. We have the idea of primaries. We have the idea of the executive, members of the executive portfolio ministers being made accountable to the members of the specialist committees. We have, I know you had an idea and I've just forgotten it.
Oh no, well after what Margaret said, I'm going to deny that.
I think Malcolm's idea was everybody should sign up to his Twitter.
About having question times that were devoted to particular ministers.
That's it.
And also being able to interrogate ministers in a more forensic way, so it isn't just the sort of one-off.
So more changes to question time.
That would be a good change.
And Margaret's idea is that the media becomes more, I think, engaged with the general population and makes itself more accountable to that population and asks what that population would like.
It takes the lead from the public, not the politicians.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've done well on that score. Now, over to you.
Percy Rogers. I'd like to ask the panel to what extent they feel that the WikiLeaks is making a contribution to democracy, or is it a threat to democracy? The revealing of the truth may well be a threat to those politicians who very occasionally say something which is false.
I think it's a good thing, WikiLeaks, and I think if senior people are saying one thing privately to another government overseas, but a different thing to their own people, I believe they should be exposed, as some have been.
Can I just... what if they're saying some things privately to a government overseas and nothing to their people here? And what if there's a reason for that?
There can be a reason for it, but then you need to be very careful about what means of communication you make or use.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'd just say that it's almost irrelevant as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably both, depending on the circumstances and the content. But it is unstoppable. We better get used to it. I think Assange is now subject to such an enormous variety of pressures that he may well not survive as an individual phenomenon. But WikiLeaks and the phenomenon and the software which drives that is unstoppable. It's here for keeps.
I'm a bit of a transparency nut, Fran, and so, you know, I semi-seriously would say to people that I would have held cabinet meetings in public.
Yes.
That would have been good for the entertainment industry, I can tell you.
Well, you didn't strengthen the freedom of information legislation, which you should have.
No, in fact, that's not correct. The government did by abolishing conclusive certificates. In fact, I went to the High Court about the issue of conclusive certificates several years ago, so maybe we didn't go as far as many would like. I'd concede that, but there were some significant reforms. And, of course, not everybody shares my views on the importance of transparency, but I think the critical thing here is that you can't be selective and say that you're in favour of transparency when it's information being released that you like being released and against transparency when it's information that you don't want out. You've got to have a principled position.
Can I just look, I've written and spoken a lot about this, so I'm not going to try and summarise it, but just on the issue of Assange. The Americans, I think, have made a very big mistake in trying to demonise this guy, and some of the reaction has been right over the top. They've turned him into a sort of a martyr. They've actually enhanced his standing, and it's all reminiscent for Lucy and me about what Margaret Thatcher did to Peter Wright with Spycatcher years ago. Nothing seems to have been learnt. I just say that a lot of this information is obviously very embarrassing. I'm prepared to accept that some of it has been strategically damaging. But the information that has made a contribution to democracy, or the cause thereof, has been the information that reveals hypocrisy on the part of governments. Now, the Americans actually come out of this stuff pretty well, by the way, but some of those governments, some of the Arab governments, several of which have now been overthrown, which were revealed as saying one thing to their people and a very different thing to the Americans, that inconsistency has helped bring them undone. Now, you know, I'm prepared to say that's probably a good thing, but as Joe and Lai said about the French Revolution, it's also too early to tell.
Okay. There's a question upstairs.
Karen Kakis from the Property Council. Malcolm, yesterday you put forward for the first time the idea of a support for the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund. As a first-time policy idea that took leadership. In the panel's view, how do we move past today's risk-averse party politics to tackle long-term, meaningful party policies? In essence, how do we break the cycle of the race to vanilla to meet the short attention span of the nation?
Okay, well, do you want me to... let me just... I think a good way to start and contribute to policy debates is to, take a proposition that we should have another sovereign wealth fund, argue it, hopefully reasonably coherently, take, as I did in the paper and the speech, take account of arguments pro and con. I mean, I canvassed Ken Henry, who's very against it, explained why he was against it and why I disagreed with him, and provide what I like to see as some policy meat. Now, it may just end up being a chopping block that other people tear to shreds, but at least you've got some policy meat there. I don't think you can sensibly go out in politics and say, we should have a sovereign wealth fund, full stop. You've actually got to provide some details, some facts and some arguments, and then people can read that and agree or disagree. And in the course of the debate that follows, you may well change or modify your own position. But, let's at least have, for heaven's sake, look, I'll tell you what prompted me to do this was Glenn Stevens gave a speech in Britain in which he said, we are having a debate in Australia about what we should do with the fruits of the boom and this great terms of trade bonanza we're having. Well, the sad truth is that without any reflecting on the Reserve Bank Governor, we weren't really having that debate at all, at least not in politics. And I thought it was about time we did. And so hopefully this is one angle of that. There are a lot of others that can contribute to that. And so, in a year from now, maybe we'll have some resolution.
But
you go.
If you can achieve that, all of that's good. But if it's going to work, you're going to have politicians who will give up the short, sharp, cheap shot of trying to say what's good for today's vote or tomorrow's vote, and who are prepared to take a long-term view of things and make a judgment about what's best for Australia instead of what's best for votes over the next week.
And Lindsay, is the length of the electoral cycle any part of that?
No, I don't think that's really an issue, and I'd give a one-word answer to the question, that is participate. If you take Malcolm's an unusual example. He's a former leader and therefore gets a bit of licence for all kinds of reasons. But if you take, let's say, somebody who's of a lesser stature on either side, putting forward an idea like that and breaking technical bounds of shadow cabinet solidarity or whatever, if that hangs out there in a vacuum, they're in big trouble. If lots of other people and organisations start commenting on it, criticising it, debating it, then guess what will happen? Then that person's colleagues will start to crab walk over to that territory. So the answer is participate. That's how you support people promoting ideas, even if you're criticising them. As long as you're dealing with the merit of the issue, participate. That's what supports people in politics generating ideas and policy options.
Margaret, are you happy if I go back to the floor here? Next question downstairs.
David, I'm a university student. Lindsay Tanner and Malcolm Turnbull seem to have been in fairly high positions in their respective parties over the past couple of years, and you both seem to understand what we've been talking about tonight and have seems like some solutions to fix it. So why hasn't it been fixed? Is there something stopping either of your parties or you within the parties from putting these solutions you've talked about into implementation? Is it something to do with the party organisation or what?
Lindsay, why didn't you fix it?
No, well, the answer is that we are all collectively human, and the notion that we are dealing with something that there is this kind of discrete problem, that there is a magic potion somewhere up on a shelf that one of us groping around can find that can be applied to the patient and bingo, back to life, is simply a fallacious way of looking at it. Life's messy. Politics is messy, particularly in a democracy. You will never fix things as such. You can improve things, you can try and ameliorate problems, but it is really not the right way to look at it to say, well, you know, there's got to be some solution. Things are much too complex for that reason. There will always be deficiencies in any democratic process. There will always be weaknesses, but the key thing is to be conscious of them, to be thinking about them, debating them and trying to improve things all the time. But there is no way that, whether it's Malcolm, me or anybody else, that anybody can come up with some kind of magic fix to perceived problems. People don't even agree on what the problems are. I think most of Malcolm's and my colleagues, if they're up here tonight, would be having all kinds of different points of view from ours. So
people can do it. It depends on the leverage they have. I mean, we saw Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor, Bob Catter and Andrew Wilkie change the way Parliament works because they had a particular...
I'd say position. Marginally. It's helpful things, but... Changes people have been talking about for a long time, though. Yeah, I'm not criticising them because I think they probably pushed things about as far as they could, but ultimately, you know, getting time limits on answers, well, that's kind of helpful, but it doesn't change the fact that question time's still a circus.
Well, I've had members of one of the major parties, and I'm not going to say which one, telling me that things are working much better because now they're listened to when before they weren't.
Yeah, I think the times on the time limits on answers have been enormously beneficial.
Okay,
I think it was a very good move.
Upstairs, do we have a question? Yes.
Hi, my name is April. To me, the question of ethical and substantial political discourse is one that seems tautological. Between the media and politicians, kind of seem like the mirror image of yourselves. I believe, and I want to know if you believe, that it's actually up to the community as consumers of this media to, you know, have an surgence of, or an advocation of wanting to hear something more substantial, because I really do believe that between, no offence, both of you, it's not going to happen. So it really is up to the community to try and bring it back.
Okay, as Tony would say, I think that's I'll take that as a comment. And Margaret, you might like to comment on it.
Well, you know, we are all part of this community. Everybody on this stage is everybody in the room. So when you say it's the community's job, you know, that implies all of us, I think. But generally speaking, I would agree, and I think the opportunities for the community to make its voice heard are greater now than ever before. I also thought the previous question was extremely good. You know, I mean, we've all come up with good ideas tonight. At least people seem to think they're good ideas. You know, why didn't you do it? I don't think that one got answered.
There's 0.01% of the Australian population appear to be responding favourably in this hall. God only knows what everybody else might think. Look, I think that's a very good question, and the truth is the community does have probably the dominant role in this. It may amaze people to realise, but politicians are actually no different from anybody else. They try to do things they think they'll get rewarded for, and they try and avoid doing things they'll get punished for. They try and improve their situation, they try and get promoted, get better positions by doing things that all the signals surrounding them tell them will get approval. So ultimately,
but Lindsay, that's a sorry state if that's where it ends.
But I'm not suggesting it's only the community. The politicians are central to this, as are the media. But the guy who runs Channel 9 Current Affairs years ago said to me, every time we have a politician on a current affair, 100,000 viewers change the channel. So I don't blame him for making a decision that says, well, maybe we better have fewer politicians on a current affair. So there is a significant role for the community here. It is, in effect, a marketplace of ideas, of voting, of democracy, and it is, the community are not a passive, inert group of people on whom this is all imposed. They're a critical part of this. But politicians, the media, got fundamental responsibilities, true, but the community, I think the questions are absolutely appropriate.
But politicians could do a little less in listening to focus groups who are not necessarily educated in what they're being asked about, and a little more in exercising their own judgment And if they believe if that's the right course, how do I then persuade people that what I believe to be right is right? And how many are prepared to live or fall on that? In a sense, Malcolm is one of the very few who did on the EPS.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a lot of sort of fear being struck into hearts, which means ideas aren't being put forward, even though they might be held, that a lot of politicians are frightened to chance their arm because of the way it might get treated, and that's no way for us to have a healthy democracy.
By the party organisations.
Fran, can I just make an observation here? I think, you know, we've talked a lot about democracy and process, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. But one of the things you've got to look at from the community's point of view is what are the outcomes? What have we actually delivered? If you look at the national level, there has been a failure over the last few years to successfully tackle reform on a whole range of important issues. I mean, the whole water reform that John Howard and I, you know, pioneered when we were in government, and which the Labor Party supported, has been hopelessly mismanaged by this Labor government and is in real danger of, you know, of falling away. Now that's a pretty important issue. Climate change, we are further away from having a national response to climate change than we were 5 or 6 years ago. If you go to the state level, you look at, I won't comment on Victoria, where we've got a fine new government, and we've got a fine new government in New South Wales, but just consider this. We had 16 years of a Labor government that became so rancid that it was nearly wiped out. That was democracy at work. But the shocking thing is that it was able to stay there for 16 years and do so little, and it kept on getting re-elected. Now, you know, that is a big question that we've got to, because we've got to look at it. I mean, there, you know, in my state, in New South Wales and Sydney, in this capital city, there has been virtually no investment in public transport, mass transit, over the last 15 years. Shanghai has 420 kilometres of subway, carries 6 or 7 million people a day. They only opened it in 1995.
And they got the population equivalent to Australia's.
And I'm going to interrupt here because
a little bit bigger than Sydney.
We're over time now, but I think we'll take one more question. I think we can squeeze that. Am I allowed to? Yes. But I am going to say something there, which is surely the notion of whether you do things or not goes again to the quality of the people you have in the leadership positions in our political parties. Surely we come back to that point where Malcolm started. Last question.
Russell Yardley. Gutenberg's 15th century technology of printing was more efficient in putting letters and words on paper. That wasn't the impact on politics. What was the impact was it meant there was a greater consistency of spelling. There were separations of words, which meant there was less need for reading out loud, which meant there was more room for private thought. Private thought introduced major changes to the political process. Today we have internet technologies which in fact allows us, millions of people, to curate ideas and therefore to assemble groups. Groups are essential to politics and its potential for fundamental change. What fundamental changes? We've talked, I think, about the margins tonight. What fundamental changes will technology make to the political process?
Who wants to take that first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think what it is doing is disintermediating, cutting out the media. I mean, not cutting it out completely, but everybody becomes a journalist. There's been a debate about whether Assange is a journalist. Is he entitled to the protection of freedom of the press? Well, we're all journalists. Every one of us that puts 140 characters on Twitter, expresses an opinion, is doing something that is as worthy of protection as someone who writes a leader in The Age, or has a blog, or writes something in a magazine. So that ability for everybody to communicate, chaotic though it may appear, is really radical, because it is empowering millions of people who did not have a voice before.
So what impact is it going to have on our democracies? I'm sorry to hurry things along, but we need to get out. So,
well, I think what it means is that you will get a lot of opinions that previously were censored out of the main media. Some of them more edifying than others. Some of them more enlightened than others. That will be able to get traction. So it is going to be a much more challenging time. You won't have opinion curated to use a verb you've mentioned, sir, by the media, you will have opinion being much freer. And in some respects, you're almost going back to the 18th century when news media consisted of people just distributing pamphlets and handbills in their community, except now it's electronic handbills in a global community.
Well, in a sense, we've had the biggest question last, and there are so many different aspects of it I could tackle, but I'll just take this one. One of the big differences that the invention of the printing press made is it meant that people identified not only with their village or their immediate community, but with a larger area and ultimately the nation state. Now, we are now seeing changes to that. If I'm reading a blog on digital photography, for example, I may well identify with an international community that shares my interest, as well as being a part of a community that identifies with my suburb, as well as being part of a community which is talking about what's happening at the local school. So we're having all these different ideas of community. The question is, how do we vote for a national leader, for example, or for a national party when we're all in our own little niches? And I think that is actually, if we want to reinvent and refresh fourth estate ideals for the media, that's where it lies. How do we connect all these niche audiences and make sure that we can all talk about the same thing?
I think there's an important reality check that we need here, and I'm as enthusiastic about these developments as I know Malcolm is, and I suspect Margaret is, but the printing press emerged in the 15th century. You didn't see the emergence of mass literacy in developed nations basically until the 19th century. Things like Twitter and Facebook and blogging, all these things are certainly now mass engaged audiences. They are still a more educated and a younger proportion of the population, and there is still a vast number of people out there who have little or no connection with these things, and it's reasonable to expect that that will continue for some time. Probably we'll end up at a point where they are quasi-universal, but like any dramatic technological change, it can take generations to wash through behaviour. So we need to be really careful in these kind of discussions not to think that everybody else is just like us, tweeting away and blogging away and all this kind of stuff, because they aren't, believe me. And the numbers are increasing, but there's still a huge number of people out there who are not connected to this new world. They vote, they're citizens, they're just as important as anybody else, and they are very large in number.
Well, I would say that we're right at the beginning, but that's the point. That's the point. We're only right at the beginning.
Yeah.
No, I agree entirely with that. Yeah.
And Malcolm Fraser, do you want to add to that? I mean, are we talking about a two-tier, two-speed democracy?
I think you'd be surprised how much people from all over the place in all sorts of jobs, young, retired, whatever, are enormously concerned about the current state of play. I've had young people coming to me and say, I'd love to go into politics, but I wouldn't consider the Labor Party and I won't consider the Liberal Party. And they have got firm, cogent reasons, which actually I would support, why they don't join either of those parties. And until there is a change in the way the political parties themselves conduct the process, I think they're deceiving themselves if they think it's just the media. I mean, after all, they're feeding the media. And they don't necessarily have to feed it in the way they are.
And on that note, I would like to thank you for being with us and thank our panel, Margaret Simons, Malcolm Turnbull, Lindsay Tanner and Malcolm Fraser. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions tonight. Thanks just for being here. As I say, I think it's fantastic so many people come out on a Friday night to discuss a meaty issue like is our democracy broken. The Wheeler Centre's Talking Point series continues. If you want to find out more about forums like this, their website www.wheelercentre.com, and you can find out when the next discussion is. Thank you so much for your company. Good night. Thank you.